Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt, from your international travels.
Thank you, Tom. It is good to be back in the USA.
Matt, you were at an SCCE Europe event last week. You've written about it several times. This is our first chance to podcast about it. What was it that you wanted to maybe visit on the podcast that you saw or heard last week?
Tom, I thought it would be fun to talk a bit about a session that I sat in on, which was an excellent discussion of leaks. Employees leaking confidential information to the public and how compliance officers might have to deal with that. A leak is something that could ruin a whole big internal investigation you have. So part of the discussion was the mechanics of how you would try to prevent leaks. However, there was this other whole line of inquiry and discussion at this panel session about what leaks say about your corporate culture. Because if employees are leaking things, clearly they are not speaking up the chain of command, they are speaking out to the greater public. And they somehow have come to the conclusion that management is not doing the right thing. And therefore, I, leaker, am going to try to force the issue by putting sensitive information out in the public domain. So I think there are a lot of substantive issues to talk about around corporate culture and employee leaks as well. And before we go any further, I also do want to give a shout out to the two people who put this session together. That was Ann Sultan, who is a partner at the law firm Miller Chevalier, and Ian Moolman, who is the ethics and compliance leader at Emirates Global Aluminum. I know them both. I think they are both outstanding compliance professionals, and you put them together. It was a great idea that they had to have this discussion on leaks, and there's a lot that compliance officers could chew over here.
So, Matt, it strikes me there's a couple of different types of leaks that might come out of an organization. And you talked about one of those in your blog post, which is good enough to snicker at, which is telling employees don't leak. Well, of course, what happens that it is immediately leaked.
Yes.
But there's also a type of leak that is used in a more strategic way, which is information that someone wants to put out to a broader set of people to put pressure on the person they're talking about. So typically, if a corporation has information and they're forming an internal investigation, a person may leak that information to put pressure on the employer to do something, whether it's compensate, whether it's take action, whether it may be other. First, my first question to you, is that a differentiation that you can considered in this? But then tell us about the Facebook example you wrote about and why that's such a great example of a toxic culture and the leaking.
Yeah, so that did come up in the discussion that we were having last week about essentially what is a leaker trying to accomplish? And the leaker is basically trying to force the company to respond to the leaker's agenda rather than the company pursuing its own agenda. You have some matter you are investigating. Some employee, for some reason, thinks that the company isn't doing the investigation well, or maybe they're thinking it's trying to bury the investigation, or they're looking at the wrong people, or covering something up. So they take confidential information about that issue and leak it. Sometimes they would leak it to a specific destination, like a member of the media. Sometimes they would just shotgun it out across the greater internet for everybody. I suppose in theory, you could just shotgun it within the whole enterprise, because usually investigations are kept quite confidential. And if you tell everybody in the organization what's going on, that can be an effective stink bomb. It's probably not as stinky as shotgunning something to the New York Times or all over Blue Sky or Facebook or something like that. But that's why leaks happen. The Facebook example that I'm talking about is that very recently, Facebook announced that it had fired 20 employees for leaking. And basically what had happened was, once Mark Zuckerberg started announcing his big changes to Facebook earlier in February, maybe the end of January, where he was walking away from fact checking, scrapping a lot of diversity requirements or diversity policies at Facebook, doing how he wanted to inject more masculine energy and what does all that mean. So employees started leaking all of this. instead of Facebook setting that narrative. And Facebook managers were not happy about the leaks of these changes. So they said, don't leak it. And of course, employees then leaked the information and then leaked that they were told not to leak it. I look at that as a reflection of Facebook's, I suspect, highly dysfunctional culture. These changes that Mark Zuckerberg is forcing upon the company, which he can do. He is the CEO. He was one of the founders of Facebook way back then, and he is the largest shareholder and head of the board at Facebook. He can do these things, but a lot of employees at Facebook do not agree with them. So I think they are leaking this as a pressure tactic against him. And I think it just shows what I had mentioned earlier, that they disagree with where Zuckerberg wants to take the corporate culture. So they're trying to get people to pay more attention to these changes. Internal surveys, which of course have been leaked, of Facebook employees show that a solid plurality of them are not thrilled with this. I don't think a majority are outright opposed to what Zuckerberg's going to do, but a lot of employees, they don't like it. So they're trying to bring pressure to bear on him. And this is one way that they're trying to bring that pressure upon him. But all of it points to what I said before, Tom. This is a wackadoo corporate culture, and there's a lot of tension there. And I think if everybody were rowing in the same direction, the propensity for leaking would be much diminished, if not disappeared. If you have a lot of leaks, that means something somewhere in your corporate culture is not working well. That's my thesis, and I think it's correct.
Let me test that a little bit. We have 20 people fired. How many employees at Facebook? 25,000, 50,000?
More than that, upwards of 70,000, I think.
Pretty small sample size of those who got fired for leaking, number one. But number two, in thinking about this, particularly at Facebook, if we recognize that internal reporting is a trusted channel, and I recognize that's several levels from where Facebook may be, but there are mechanisms to report internally. If your management is antithetical to those in your employee base who disagree with the administration, and the management goes kissing up to the administration, I'm not sure reporting internally is going to be either safe or well received. And I'm not quite sure how else you can express your distaste.
I think that is a good diagnosis of the problem. I would say that yes, 20 employees fired for leaking is a minuscule percentage of the whole workforce, but it sends a strong example. And Facebook has readily said in public statements that they expect there will be more leakers who will be fired, so that they are really putting some draconian measures against people who feel like they want to speak out instead of speaking up. But Tom, to your latter point there, like what else are employees going to feel like they should do if they feel that speaking up is of no consequence? Either they don't believe that the internal hotline and internal speak up culture is secure and safe. They feel threatened, so they're going to leak it. Or they feel that speaking upward isn't going to result in any change. In that case, if I feel like management's not listening to me, what should I do? I guess I'm going to take what I can and share it with other people who I think will agree with me that the culture is going in the wrong direction. That's why I'm going to leak. I think that is the rationale for most leakers. They see that something is happening at the company they believe is wrong. They believe speaking to management about it isn't going to be productive. Either they'll face some sort of punishment and retaliation, or they will feel like nothing's going to get done. But they still want the right thing to be done, so they take their issue to others out in the greater world who hopefully the leaker thinks, hopefully some other people will agree with me that this is a terrible thing, and then maybe there'll be pressure. But Tom, all of this is just a long-winded way of saying you got problems with your internal speak-up culture. And I have seen studies before. Ethisphere years ago put out a study that many employees want to speak up about misconduct they see internally. Why? Because they want change to happen and they want their company to succeed and they want to do the right thing. However, they don't actually report. Again, why? Because they feel that they will be retaliated against, or they feel like nothing will happen. And Ethisphere put out that report years and years ago before the pandemic. And I'm sure it still exists and holds true today that there are these dysfunctions in corporate culture. That's what drives people to step outside the culture with what they know. And that's a leak.
What is the role of compliance if management has said we are rowing in this direction? Should compliance listen to those who want to row in a different direction? Do they catalog that information and report it up? Do they tell those, sorry? Other than fixing a toxic culture, which is several other podcast episodes,
Yep.
what can a compliance officer do in this situation?
I'm not saying it is an easy position for an ethics and compliance officer to be in. However, I do think that compliance officers could, depending on their relationship with senior management and the board, have conversations about the corporate culture here and is it toxic or not? And certainly if there are a lot of employee leaks, or if there are employee sentiment surveys showing employees aren't happy, or there are scathing reviews on Glassdoor or blind.com or these other websites where employees can go and vent their feelings, objectively, you should be able to go and point to those kind of examples and say, look, management, the employees believe we have a toxic culture and we have to meet the employees where they are. We can't tell all 70,000 of them that they are wrong and the 100 senior executives are right. Corporate culture is great. That's not the way it works. You could have some conversations about the overall state of the culture. You could keep track of how many leaks are happening and use that as evidence to say that clearly employees don't feel comfortable speaking up and we're going to have to address this somehow. Gets a little bit more tricky if management says, yeah, we're going to address it by firing everybody, which sounds to me an awful lot like beatings will continue until morale improves. But also at a more tactical level, you can think through what are the internal processes and controls we have to prevent leaks, which in many cases have nothing to do with these great moral issues that we're raising about corporate culture and whatnot. This is just more like you have a sensitive investigation. You don't want that stuff spilling out. You don't want that information being leaked to private litigants or something like that. There are a lot of practical reasons why you should have tight controls over confidential information to reduce the chance for leaks in the first place. That is separate from and still correct that you should do that, even if having leaks is also a sign of a dysfunctional corporate culture. Both things can be true at the same time. You should try to reduce leaks, and if you have a lot of them, you got an issue.
Let's go into the weeds with some of the practical tips you suggest or you heard to actually fight leaks that might be of more confidential information, internal investigations, or other data that the company does not want released to the general public.
Yeah, that was a good point that Ian Sultan and Ian Molman talked about. There are numerous technical measures that could be implemented. Even if the compliance officer doesn't know how to do it, I'm sure your friends in IT or internal audit could help you out with it. But for example, you could encrypt all confidential information related to an investigation. You could implement access controls to confidential files, make sure that you are able to track and log who accesses what information at what time. I think together, the tight access controls and encryption can work quite well because either you are controlling who gets access to the data, or if somebody somehow navigates all of that and gets a hold of the data anyways, if it's encrypted, then they can't read it. There was one example somebody gave during the discussion where you might have an automated alert to senior investigators anytime somebody tries to access files from an unusual location. That is a anti-fraud control that banks have been using forever. You use your credit card when you're out of state or in a foreign country, and suddenly that bank is wondering if that's a fraudulent activity. Same dynamic applied internally. Is this lawyer who is on the case actually really logging into a remote server from Iran or from Zimbabwe or from Brazil? Or why aren't they logging in from the conference room? That kind of stuff. And we should always remember that access controls are compromised by somebody stealing legitimate credentials and somebody else using them. So it's screening tools like that. You could think through your investigation processes more largely, and remember that the longer an investigation takes, the more likely it is that you are likely to suffer a leak. So therefore, think about, how are we communicating with parties involved in the investigation? Are we leaving them twisting in the void with no update whatsoever for weeks or months? That's probably a bad process control. So try to build in something like you send them regular alerts, even if the alert is, we have nothing new to report yet. But anytime that you can try and keep people involved in the investigation as subjects, as targets, as reporters, as anybody else, just keep them aware that this is still a thing in progress. And you, person, are still part of this larger goal that we're striving towards of finding the truth. That's going to make them feel like they are involved in doing the right thing or getting to the truth, and they will be less likely to leak. You could certainly try training and policy attestations. Think through, certain managers would probably deserve different types of training and maybe more strict attestations or a non-disclosure agreement than rank and file employees. Unless, of course, the employee is rank and file but pulled into an investigation, then you sit them down and say, per page whatever in the employee handbook, now you have to sign a non-disclosure and a confidentiality agreement while the investigation's ongoing. Here's the form. There are steps that you could take like that. I am sure any external law firm would be happy to give you more detail on that at some exorbitant fee. But the point being, there's lots of ways on a very practical day-to-day basis at the control level, the process level, the employee training level to try and reduce the chance for leaks to happen generally.
Matt, when I read your blog post to prepare for our podcast today, it struck me, or I was reminded rather, of a story which appeared both in the New York Times Deal Book and Matt Levine's column today in Bloomberg. And it is two HR firms. One is Rippling, and the second is Deal, I think, if I get this, yes. Rippling accuses Deal of having a mole inside the company who data mined the company's Slack channel for information, which he then communicated to Deal, and Rippling contends it's a trade secret. And I recognize it's a little bit different when you make a claim of trade secret, involves legal protections that, at least at one point, were fairly well established in law. But it led me to maybe, I've always wondered about the communication style of Slack, and that a lot of people put things in Slack that I think, as a lawyer, are confidential and shouldn't be talked about to everyone in the corporation. On the other hand, you want to have a trusted channel that people can communicate their feelings, thoughts, or other. Is that just a dynamic tension that's always going to exist, or is there a role for compliance in that as well?
A few things here. First, I would say the situation between Rippling and Deal, to be clear, that is not a leak. If you are sending a mole in to steal information, that's espionage, and that's theft of confidential information or trade secrets or intellectual property or whatever. But it's not a leak. Second, there is a tension between, you want people to feel comfortable with communicating confidential company information, A, just to do their jobs, or B, to raise concerns to management. And there do have to be trusted channels and a trusted culture to be able to do that. I was struck as I was thinking about that leak session and writing up my post, and just even when I was in the room, how often the word trust was the subtext to all of this. If employees are not trusting the company, the system, the manager, that's going to lead them to take information outside the company and leak it. I was about to say to take a leak, but we won't go there. But, I think the challenge with a lot of modern communication is that it's very easy to develop a false sense of informality. And you are, in electronic communications, exchanging vastly more data. Huge amounts of data that you can have exchanged in a electronic Slack conversation, in a text message, in an email. But B, it's harder to control, and there's a written record of it all. Once the thing is leaked out there, the file is posted on Twitter or Blue Sky or Facebook, file's out there. It ain't coming off. You will always have this irretrievable thing. Once it is leaked, I would guess in the pre-internet days, could you take some confidential report and leak it to a reporter? Sure, but you're taking one copy at a time. That paper copy could be seized, and that paper copy at best is going to be 20, 30, 50, 100 pages. You could shotgun the entirety of your corporate database onto a text message and ruin everything for a company if you wanted. So the stakes are higher, and the stakes are for more modern communication. But at the same time, the old things still work. You want employees to feel comfortable speaking, and then that can lead them into a false sense of informality. It can cause all sorts of mischief, but I don't know what the solution is to it.
Man, it's a fascinating conundrum that I think we may be able to visit about in the future.
Thank you very much, Tom.